The word amicus, meaning friend, comes from a derivation, as if it were animi custos, or guardian of the soul. And this is well put. The term for someone tormented by carnal desire is amator turpitudinis, a lover of wickedness. But friend, amicus, is from the word hamus, a hook. In other words, the chain of charity, since hooks hold on.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we are looking at Isidore of Seville's book, The Etymologies.
This is not necessarily a book that many of our listeners will perceive as mainstream.
This is a book where, if last episode when we talked about Boethius, if that sort of Latin nerdery was a turnoff, this episode is not going to work for you. But if you were into that, this episode's going to have it in droves, because this is a book that is very much written in Latin, and the meaning of the book is woven into the language itself.
Mm-hmm. It gives us a challenge that I think is in some ways a little bit reminiscent of when we've talked about books that had a strong visual element. So when we did the Hereford Mappa Mundi, for example, and we had to describe what we were seeing and the way the words fit into the image. And when we've done graphic novels, there was a lot we had to put into words that you normally don't need to do. So this, I think, gives us a comparable kind of challenge.
Yeah. And this is also interesting because there is an English translation of this text. We have a little rule. We're not going to highlight as one of our main episodes a book that doesn't exist in translation in English, because that seems a little bit unfair to readers, though we will certainly talk about other books and have bonus episodes potentially on books that aren't translated into English. But we wanted our main ones to all be accessible-ish for our audience. And this does have a translation, but it's a very curious book to translate, again, because it's so imbricated in its language. The translation is perfectly good and serviceable, and includes tremendous amounts of the Latin in parentheses, telling you exactly what is going on, or trying to tell you what is going on. But it's definitely a book that you're going to appreciate more if you've got a little Latin under your belt, and maybe even a little Greek.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting how the translation has to put Latin terms in parentheses all the time. And it doesn't feel like an interruption. It's actually really helpful, but it's always bringing you back, right? Giving you those hooks that take you back into the Latin text, which is really neat.
I suppose we should also say this is an encyclopedia, for some meaning of that term. It is, in a sense, a reference work. It's not really a work that's intended to be read from beginning to end, I would argue. I think most people would argue. And we've never looked at a proper reference book before. I guess the Hereford map is close, but that feels like it's something a little different.
Yeah, not because I haven't tried to steer us down that path.
I'm willing to go down that path, but
Yeah. No, one other detail, actually, I think it's kind of interesting to note as we're getting into this text is, we're talking about it being a bit niche, which, fair enough, but it's also was a hugely, hugely popular book from late antiquity through the Middle Ages into the early modern period, with literally about 1,000 manuscripts that survive. And people who know anything about manuscript culture will be like, wow, that's a lot, among the highest number for any book. And that is really interesting because it tells us something about medieval reading practices. This is a book that a lot of people found useful, maybe not all in the same way, but a lot of people were drawn to. And that's something we might want to think about.
Exactly. I mean, I guess for comparison, off the top of your head, can you remember how many manuscripts exist of, say, the Canterbury Tales?
It's not that many. It's definitely less than 100. So, and that's a work that was very popular in its own time. The kinds of things that end up having many copies are works that often don't speak as much to us today, but were really meaningful for medieval readers. So things that were very popular include, I don't know if you know Peter Riga's Aurora, which is a kind of versified Bible text. So it's very, very memorable. So if you wanted to retain biblical narratives in ways that had kind of pithy verse forms that you could use for different purposes, that kind of thing exists in many copies. So it's just a different way of thinking about how the book serves the reader. Helps to explain why something like Isidore's Etymologies was hugely popular.
Yeah. I mean, I guess also we say popular, and by that we largely mean the number of manuscripts that exist and the number of different circumstances we find it being read or being owned.
And imitated and expanded and built upon.
But this doesn't mean it was like an airport bestseller. equivalent. It's not like everybody had it at their tip of their tongues in all strata of society.
It doesn't. It doesn't. It means that it's everywhere in medieval libraries. For 1,000 manuscripts to survive means that there were so many more others.
Right.
So like airport bestseller, I guess, is presuming a certain kind of reader, a certain kind of casual reader and easy access to reading that basically almost everyone has. And the medieval world is not a world like that. I mean, literacy is very restricted, but within that constraint, the book's all over.
Yeah. Okay. So if you were literate, which is a big if, you probably had encountered Isidore or someone talking about Isidore.
Absolutely. Inevitably. Yeah. And the logic of language that comes from Isidore is absolutely everywhere.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about who Isidore is, first of all?
Yeah, so Isidore of Seville is a bishop, writer, intellectual, kind of a leader in his region, both in terms of the church and also politically, in the late 6th and early 7th century. So he's born somewhere around 560, and we know he dies in 636. And this is a kind of a weird time. It's after the sort of conclusive fall of the Roman Empire in the West. We talked a little bit about that. How can I put it? The variability of that end date with regard to Boethius when we talked together last time. Because, the Roman Empire in the West, around Rome itself is falling apart already around, 400 or so. And so by the time you get to Isidore's time, that's conclusively done. There are regional seats of control and power. And where Isidore is over in the Iberian Peninsula in Visigothic Spain, you have a certain kind of regime that is got control of the territory, and yet a lot is in flux. And the Christian church is sort of a source of continuity in that region during that period. So Isidore himself was raised by his older brother, who was probably an abbot in a monastery. And that brother and another brother and a sister of his were also all in religious orders. So these are people who are belonging to a well-connected family who become part of the church order in a way that sort of perpetuates that authority that they have. Isidore was well connected to ecclesiastical patrons. He was actually close with Pope Gregory. So that's a really important relationship for him. But also he had royal connections with the sort of, I don't want to call it a revolving door exactly, but the different kings of the region. And there was one that he was particularly close to that was a patron of some of his works. So he was also like I said, his authority extended to being in charge of a couple of important councils, Council of Seville, Council of Toledo. And he's canonized as a saint well after his own lifetime at the end of the 16th century. The really important thing, or at least the thing that I find most interesting, is the range and variability of the works he produced. So the Etymologies we're going to talk about together, but he also wrote other works that are interested in unpacking language in a comparable kind of way, including the Allegories, which are about names that show up in the Bible, and he unpacks those names in a way that's like in the Etymologies, but even more rich and abundant and plural and multiple.
Right. Yeah. We get a little bit of that here, but he
really
goes
goes to town
off
there.
in the dedicated book.
Yeah, totally. And then he has a book on numbers, which again does that kind of allegoresis, but this time with regard to number. Then again, here in the Etymologies, we get that a bit in the math book.
I've read the number book. It's fun.
Right? We both love that stuff. But he also wrote a book of natural philosophy, so science, insofar as you have it in the 7th century, on the nature of things. A number of theological works, including a book that's Contra Judaeus, a book commenting on the status of Judaism relative to Christianity, which is not as bad as some of them.
Yeah.
Not great, but it's not as bad as some of them. That's most you can say. He writes a world chronicle and also a really interesting history that's about specific kings of the Goths, the Vandals, and the Suevorum. I don't know what that is in English. I mean, there will be Swabians, but I don't know if that's quite the same thing. Anyway, so he's writing these history books, natural philosophy, history books, and these sort of languagey books, these intensely languagey books. And even one of his theological works, which is on the Trinity and the nature of Christ and paradise and all that kind of thing, is called De Differentiis Verborum. So he's really using language to unpack all different kinds of meaning. And so all of his works, I think, kind of inhabit this space. The Etymologies, though, was a huge, huge undertaking. He was still working on it when he died, though I can't imagine what else you could add to it. Like, it's pretty freaking capacious already.
It is. I mean, there's always another book to add, I suppose.
I guess, right? And as we said earlier, lots of copies, hugely popular, hugely influential. And again, not just through the Middle Ages, right, but into the early modern period when printing starts. the Etymologies is one of the first things that gets printed. There's clearly a market for it. So you asked about bestsellers in the airport. Like, clearly it is.
Wow.
Well, no, I mean, if you talk about early printing, they're printing the books that are going to sell.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by the airport, right? I mean, they're going to sell.
Sure. Yes.
And there's a dozen different editions across Europe before 1500. So that's like in 30, 40 years of printing.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the handy things about the book is that it just talks about so many different topics. It's a good book to have around. You can just open it up and you can flip through it. I guess like any compelling encyclopedia, you can just open it up and wander. And that's certainly how I like to read it. It's how I read it for this episode. I just flipped through it and picked out a little bit from each chapter and, read as I was going to read. There is a bit of structure to the book, I guess. It certainly begins with a predictable enough structure. It begins with the trivium, the sort of early subjects of education in the Middle Ages and before. It begins with grammar. It teaches you how to read, which is a good thing if you're going to read a book, to know what letters are. You'd think you'd know by then, but just in case. It goes on to rhetoric and dialectic or logic. That's the rest of the trivium. Then there's a chapter on the quadrivium, the sort of more advanced topics of math and geometry and music and astronomy. And then it gets into the even more specialist subjects of medicine and law. And then church stuff, several chapters on church stuff. And then a bit of a atlas of the world, so to speak, in language, where you take a tour through all the different languages and peoples of the world. That's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is also largely in the same way, a bunch of different chapters about man and animals and rocks and farming and war, things like that. But in the middle, there's an entire chapter 10 called De Vocabulis, or on words.
Oh, yeah.
And that is a very different chapter. That is just all the words that wouldn't fit somewhere else and some of the ones that would, listed alphabetically, and just going through them all and just saying where each word comes from and why that's so appropriate.
And this is the thing. It is so cool. Like, it's right in the middle there. And words are what he's preoccupied with all over, right? But here it's going to be like words squared, like words to the nth degree. It's going to be more words than you ever thought you would have. I mean, it's so good.
Yeah, no, it turns out there's a lot of words, and he wants to tell you about all of them, and he's going to use the other words to talk about those words. It's impressive. And it's probably what this book is most known for, in a sense, at least today by the specialists who are reading it, because there's a very particular style of this etymological approach to doing things. Can
you give a little bit, maybe read a little bit of the opening of the Latin of Book 10, or wherever you want? Because I feel like hearing it really gives a sense of, I don't know about the materiality of the language, like the extent to which the audibility of it and the structure of it kind of comes out in this audible way.
Yeah, he has a real way of putting things that people will imitate. I'm not saying he invented it, but he really refined it, and people will imitate it when they're doing this kind of explanatory talk about words or names later on. So we talked about the word for friend in the opening quotation, and in Latin it would go amicus per derivationem quasi animi custos. So amicus, friend, comes from derivation, from guardian of the soul, animi custos. Dictus autem propriae amator turpitudinis, quia amore turquetur libidinis, amicus ab hamo, ides a catena caritatis, unde et hami quod teneant. So amicus comes from hamo, or amo. They're in Spain and they're already starting to drop their H's. So the idea of amicus coming from a word amo sounds like that makes sense. But then we've got friend coming from the word hook, which seems really unusual, but it's coming from it because hooks hold on to you like a friend does. And they do it not through amore turquetur libidinis, being tortured by lustful love, but rather catena caritatis, which also has that lovely assonance between the two words catena and caritatis, the chain of friendship or charity or love. Caritas has a lot of different meanings. Yeah. So you get this very dense sense of wordplay that sort of draws you in, both with the kinds of rhythms and assonances that the language is making, but also by giving you this sense of the word as not just a word, as not just the meaning behind the word, but as a surface as well, and a surface that is made up of stuff that you can break apart and like nuclear fission, just explode the energy lying within.
That's such a good metaphor. I think that's exactly right, because there is that sense of energy that comes out of it. I always feel that whenever I read this, and it's sort of exciting and titillating again every time. And the engine that's driving that is etymology, right? And here I feel like it's really appropriate to just read the definition of etymology, which informs so much of what we get in the work. Isidore writes this. This is in book 1. Etymology is the origin of words, when the force of a word or a name is pieced together from its interpretation. For when you see where a name came from, you understand its point more quickly. That is to say, the investigation of every word's meaning is smoother once its etymology is understood. So there's something really interesting going on here. When you see where it came from, you understand its point more quickly. So it's a help to your understanding. But also, even though he doesn't say this explicitly here, it's a help to the remembering, right, and recall.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, there's a kind of an essential quality to the word that the meaning and the word are connected in this very fundamental way.
Right. Yes. There's a force behind the meaning, the force of the word, its meaning in that sense, or the point of the word. But that can be interpreted through the name of the word itself, the materiality of the word, the sign. Like the word itself can give you access to the meaning behind it, and you can deepen that connection to it, which
Right.
is remarkable, I think.
Yeah. And like you were saying, signs, I mean, that's a really interesting thing to press on, right? Because he's taking what, I don't know, people interested in this terminology, what was a kind of a radical realist perspective on language. Like when we talk about how things are named by name. So if I have a book here in my hand, like I say book, and book is the label, is the sign I put on the book. And one way of seeing that is kind of a nominalist perspective where, yeah, you could put whatever label you want on that. I could call this book chair. And as long as we both knew what I meant by it, it would be okay. But Isidore is saying, no, that's not how language works. It's fundamentally connected. Like it's absolutely yoked together. And you just have to follow that path to understand it.
And he understands it as being a sort of divinely ordained system, which was not the common view of how that worked, I don't think. Or at least there were people who disagree. I mean, Augustine writes at some point about that sort of distinction between the sign and the meaning of the sign, but he is not into this etymological reading at all, and he thinks it can be fun, but it's very sus. And so it's interesting to see this being taken on as something greater than that, something more meaningful about the world and how it is all fit together.
Yeah, he's very committed to this, and he actually kind of addresses this issue in an interesting and complicated way in book 9, which is the place where he's talking about the languages of nations, so the diversity of languages. And so you can see the problem immediately, right? If we're saying that the word and the thing are fundamentally connected in some way, that might be like, okay, sure. But like, there's a lot of languages. So, right, how could that be true in all of the languages, right? And so what he does is he unpacks this for us. He unpacks the originary language, he says, that used to be there for all nations, which is called Hebrew, he says. And then he says there are 3 sacred languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And he says the fact that these were written on the label of the titulus on the cross when Christ was crucified, he says, shows you that this has that special status. And he goes on to continue to break apart the different kinds of language, different forms of Latin, different vernaculars, and so on. But he's kind of using this idea of sacred languages, that is the originary language of Hebrew, and the now central language of Latin, right, which he's kind of mapping onto the movement from Judaism to Christianity. He's using that as a way of situating Latin as the place where meaning is accessible through language in a special way, in a kind of transcendent way.
Yeah, in fact, he even talks about this earlier when he discusses mystical letters of the alphabet.
Yes.
In the Greek alphabet in particular, he says there are 5 mystical letters, and I won't go into all of them, but one of the ones that I like is upsilon, which looks like a capital Y when it's written in capitals, and it signifies human life. He doesn't actually go into the whole story about why that letter signifies human life. I forget if he does it elsewhere. The idea, which gets written about in other texts, is that as you go up from the bottom, you reach a fork in the road, and one side is the good and the other side is the bad. And, that choice is fundamental to life, which is always the thing I've enjoyed. I really like how even letters are readable this way, right? They are themselves not just marks, but have their own histories and have their own meanings beyond what they're doing.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely trippy, right? So it's almost like whatever point you press upon, whether it's the letter or the number or the etymology or any, there's this layers and layers and layers of depth, right? Whether we're talking about language as it's written, like he has a section where he writes about orthography or the way in which you shape letters. And there too, he's going to unpack the meaning that is behind the different ways you shape the letters.
Yeah.
So whether it's audible, whether it's visible, whatever environment it is you're in, he's going to unpack every level of it for you.
He even talks about sign language at one point.
Ah.
It's translated here as finger signals, de notis digitorum. There are also some signals for the fingers and for the eyes as well, by which those at a distance can silently communicate with each other. This is the custom with the military. When an army is agreeing on an action, they signal assent with their hands because they cannot use their voices, which is interesting. It's not obviously not what we think of first when we think about manual languages now, but it's still there as a possibility for sign giving.
Yeah. And this, when he's talking about doing what we would call sign language and what he refers to in another kind of way, he's giving you a sense of the ways in which language is mediated through the body. And you get that, like, that's not just an abstraction, like, though we will talk about the abstraction of language. There's also these ways in which he talks about it as being mediated through the language, whether it's the signs you're making with your hands or whether it's the way that speech is formed. So, again, in the opening of Book 9, when he's talking about the languages of different nations. He talks about the sacred languages, which we described, and the different kinds of Latin. But he also talks about how people sound when they talk. So, for example, he says, all the nations of the East, like the Hebrews and the Syrians, crunch together their speech and words in their throats. All the Mediterranean nations, like the Greeks and the people of Asia Minor, strike their speech on the palate. All the Western nations, like the Italians and Spaniards, gnash their words against their teeth. Syrian and Chaldean are close to Hebrew in speech, mostly agreeing in sound. And he goes on to keep unpacking. So this idea that the materiality is audible, mediated through the flesh, as well as tangible, mediated through the parchment or the papyrus or the wax tablet, as well as abstract, he's going to give you all these dimensions of language, like every last one. That's the encyclopedic impulse.
Yeah, I guess we should talk about this as well as an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
Because part of the project is to incorporate as much of the world as he can in however long he's able to write until he has to stop for whatever reason. And he does manage to incorporate quite a lot and then put it under this etymological understanding of the world's construction, the world's intentionality. But it also, I don't know, what is, I mean, you've thought about this and you've written about this, I know. What is the encyclopedic impulse and how does it show up here?
I find it endlessly interesting. And so, like, I have to confess, I was one of those weird children who would read the encyclopedia as a child. Like, it was the Encyclopedia Britannica. My parents had it. And I was like, there was the junior one that was the red covered volumes that I read when I was little. But then I got old enough to read the big one, which was brown covered volumes. And I was like, this is great. So I know that's crazy. So,
I mean, I also read the encyclopedia as a child.
That's what I'm saying.
We had the Funk and Wagnalls one that you bought at the supermarket in installments, but we also had, and more excitingly, we had a one volume, like a thick one volume encyclopedia that had all sorts of really interesting stuff in it and full color plates, and it was really excellent. But there's something about it being in one volume in that sense that really is appealing, where it's like, yes, all the knowledge of the world is contained within this one tome.
Oh, that capaciousness, right? It's all there. I mean, I guess I emphasize that because how can I put it? I know that among our listeners, there'll be some who'll be like, yes, that's exactly what I would. And then others will be like, you weirdos, right? I mean, it's like that, right?
Yeah.
And I totally get what you're saying about the single volume encyclopedia as having a certain kind of thrill to it because it's everything is in one place, right? And there is definitely something to that. The individual volumes too, though, where it's organized by letter, it gives you a different kind of pleasure because there's the organizational principle of the alphabet that's structuring all of knowledge. It's making containers, like each letter is kind of a container within which all that knowledge fits. And so, having had that feeling about those books as a child, it is no surprise that when I encountered the etymologies when I got to grad school, I was like, this is fantastic. Especially that book 10. I was like, this is perfect.
Oh, it's phenomenal.
And so that's just the emotional kind of affective part of it, like the fun part of it. But I was thinking about this earlier today. I think the encyclopedic impulse, why would you write something like this, in the early 600s? It's presumably a time and a place when organizing knowledge and being really capacious about it and making it friendly to learners and something that they can take with them and remember in a good way is really important. And so I think thinking about that, like what are the social and political conditions that make that urgent, make that important to do, I think is one of the ways we have to think about Isidore. And of course, it's not just in the 7th century where there's this perceived importance of doing this kind of work. We have encyclopedic works that are coming out throughout the later Middle Ages. There's a kind of an efflorescence of encyclopedic writing again in the 13th and 14th centuries. People are really into it again, and they get bigger and more inflated kind of in all kinds of cool ways that we might want to talk about.
And then again in the Enlightenment, and then
Oh
again
yeah,
in the
no, it's
19th and
true.
20th
It's true.
centuries. Like,
Yeah,
it doesn't,
no.
even though our specialist period might be the Middle Ages,
Yeah, no,
it's important to keep the conversation going.
yeah, no, I guess what I mean is it comes and goes. Like
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
periods
yeah.
of intensification in the desire to write encyclopedias and then a desire. And it's really interesting to think about what is going on when that happens. I feel like what's happening is there are these times of consolidation of knowledge, right? When the systematic nature of knowledge is something that there's an urgency to put out there and an urgency amongst people to receive. There's a desire for it. Right. And so it's really neat to think about when that happens and why that happens. And also, what are the different forms it takes? So one of the things I always found tantalizing yet also a little frustrating about Isidore is that when you look at the books and you were sort of summarizing how the books go, especially early on in the opening books, and again here and there, and particularly at that midpoint, you get a strong sense of structure. So you mentioned the trivium and the quadrivium. These are the 7 subjects, the 3 liberal arts that would inform, your literacy, and then the 4 liberal arts that would inform your numeracy, I guess you would say, right? So that was understood as to be the building blocks of education. You start with the trivium and you move on to the quadrivium and then beyond, right? And so that structures the opening books, right? Books 1, 2, and 3 are just doing the trivium and the quadrivium. And then, like you said, you get medicine and laws. And there are these sections that kind of tantalizingly are kind of moving toward a lot of orderliness. Like book 11 is about man, the parts of the body, the ages of mankind, like, youth, middle life, and so on. And book 12 is about animals, different kinds of animals. And then instead of getting plants and stones, which is like, what will happen in the 13th century. And I'm like, where are the plants and stones, man? Instead, he pauses and he gives you the world, but he gives you the world 2 different ways. He gives you the world in book 13, which is about the physical structures of the world. So the 4 elements, the sky, the clouds, thunder, oceans, lakes. And then book 14 is not the world, but earth. So not mundo, but terra. And there he's going to tell you about continents and countries and, specific geographical units that are on the earth, not including the waters and all that stuff itself. So that's kind of neat. So that's really tantalizing. Like I'm like, and then later on he'll get to stones and metals over in book 16, and he's given us plants somewhere in here. I don't remember where it shows up in here. Oh, it shows up over with rustic things, with agriculture and winemaking and stuff. And so it's like I said, tantalizing because I'm like, oh man, you were almost there.
Well, I get what you're saying. Although I think, I can also.
No, that's just me. I mean.
Yeah, no, I mean, it settles into a particular pattern, and that pattern makes sense. But I think this is a reasonable list as
totally.
well. Although I also think that he's not. I sometimes get the feeling that the organizational principles are not just to organize things in an order, or rather, they're there to set up one order that might allow for interesting connections elsewhere. Or certainly that's the vibe I get when I read it. I mean, and one of the things that makes me think that is because several of the books are also very closely related to clusters that we've done on this podcast, right? Mm. There's an animals book. There is a book about war and play. So think about our cluster on sport, where we talked about how in the Aeneid and Beyond the Boundary, like sport and war or conflict are deeply connected. And, so they show up together here too. In the central chapter on, De Vocabulus, the big list of words, the alphabetical order allows all sorts of things to rub up against each other or jump from one idea to another without any real sense of connectivity, except that they are near each other in the alphabet. And that's fantastic. And to my eyes, at least, it fits in with the etymological project as well, where you are breaking the words apart and finding unlikely connections there sometimes. Some of the etymologies, I should say, are perfectly normal and obvious. It's like saying, we call things fiery because they are like fire is the equivalent. And sometimes it's like, well, we call them fiery because they create a feisty ire in people. And it's like, whoa, that seems unlikely, but okay, that's going to make me think about that again.
Yeah, no, he gives us a whole range of different possibilities from the self-evident to the increasingly creative, as you're suggesting, when he gives us etymologies. There's a really nice moment, I think, in book 3 on mathematics when he's talking about number, when he kind of gives you a little bit of that sense of range. He says this about number. He says, a number is a quantity that is made of units, unitas, for one is the germ of number, but not a number itself. The term coin, numus, gave its name to number, numerus, and from its pervasiveness, it bestowed the name. One, unis, draws its name from Greek, and he gives it. He said, thus it is for 2, duo, and 3, tres, which the Greeks called dua and tria. 4, quatuor, takes up its name from the square, quadratus. But 5, quinque, did not take its name from nature, but rather from the arbitrary will of the one who bestowed the names upon numbers. Which is a cool move, right? Because it's all making sense. So it's coming from the Greek. And then for 4, it's coming from a geometrical form, the square. Okay, cool, right? This is all making sense. And then 5, who knows? Arbitrary will, whatever.
Yeah, it's weird for him to give up like that.
I know. It's a great moment.
I love the medieval argument that 1 is not actually a number. I can't get into it right now, but it's good. I just wanted to say, like, the organization is there to allow a sort of creative chaos sometimes, or so it feels to me. It's one of the reasons I love this book. I do want to, like, I feel like we should say, like, a lot of this material that he's writing is from other sources. I don't want to make it sound like it's completely, novel to the world.
Well, one of the things he does, actually, that's kind of cool, and one of the reasons people like this book too, or find it useful, I guess, is that, like, he's doing this fascinating stuff we've been talking about in terms of etymology and the meaning of words. And he's doing this fascinating stuff with regard to categorization and structures of knowledge, like the encyclopedic impulse. But he also gives you all this wild amounts of detailed information about stuff, and some of it is coming from other textual sources, but other things are just maybe every day. For example, he'll talk about men's clothing and women's clothing, and he's just enumerating the different articles of clothing. And again, to some extent, that's probably coming from textual sources, but it also could give us some sense of what kind of clothes are normal to talk about in his time. And similar kinds of things. There's a point where he talks about the theater, which is actually kind of interesting, and the different parts of it, and tragedy and comedy and so on. So again, these are coming largely from textual sources, but nonetheless, these are things that he feels like belong in his encyclopedic account of the world. So it gives you some sense of the kinds of things people might have talked about or expected to encounter.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely a great source book to go through if you want, I don't know, I guess a sense of the vibes of the 7th century in Spain. Obviously, it's drawing from older materials, so some of it is coming out of traditions. But yeah, so here's the thing I was thinking about while we were preparing for this episode, which is that we look to a good, readable reference work. We look for 2 things usually, maybe 3 if you want to include sort of a historical understanding of a particular time period, and we're doing that kind of scholarly approach. But otherwise, we're looking for accuracy and we're looking for personality. And sometimes you can get both. And this has so much personality, even though I feel like you don't really walk away knowing anything about Isidore as a person. He doesn't insert himself at all, or not often, into the text. You don't get a sense of he likes this particular type of rock more than other types of rocks, just that it's generally agreed upon that diamonds are very pretty or whatever. But nevertheless, the way that it's written and the way that it's laid out feels so Isidore. That's so Isidore, right? And I don't know, I guess it's hard for me to put my finger on exactly what that quality is. But I recognize it when I read it in other later encyclopedists.
Yeah, this is why I tend to describe that as a flavor, like a flavor of a particular kind of writer. Like Isidore is a very distinctive flavor, right? And so when you encounter it somewhere else, you're like, oh, I recognize that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a certain attitude toward language, I think. I was thinking about this a little again earlier today. And I know this is like really far afield, but some of the writers that we've looked at, like people like Gertrude Stein and Georges Perec, they really come to mind when I'm looking at Isidore, because there's that same attentiveness to the materiality of language and the sound and like how you can kind of function at the surface level of language and get all kinds of things about it, even before you begin to dive down deep. Though Isidore will dive in deep, but he'll give you the surface as well.
Yeah, I wonder what Isidore would have made of, 20th, 21st century writers who were really invested in playing with language as part of their meaning-giving strategy.
I feel like he would have really gotten into it. I feel like he would have been right there because it's a very experimental book. And it's a very conservative book in the sense that it shaped knowledge and ways of managing knowledge for hundreds and hundreds of years, like 1,000 years, basically. But it's also very playful. I think it's incredibly playful.
Yeah. I mean, this is the subject of the dissertation that I abandoned. So basically, would people like Isidore have really enjoyed people like Georges Perec?
So what do you think?
I think, well, it's hard to say from Isidore himself because, again, I don't get a full sense of his personality and so forth. But that broad strokes of the kinds of pleasures he seeks in language, the kinds of being able to play with language and have it be meaningful and striking in different ways, and the way that you can think of language and words themselves as being meaningful sort of even outside of their meaning, or that the meaning is redundant to the word itself, in a sense. I think that's sort of where he's getting at, where the meaning is so imbricated in the letters, in the phonemes of the words, that the fact that it means something is just the cherry on top sometimes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think you're absolutely right about that. It'd be neat to find, I don't know, creative and equally playful ways to express that relationship between the kinds of things that we see Isidore doing in the Etymologies and some of those 20th century writers. It would be really neat to find ways to, I don't know, even just juxtapose passages from the two of them in a way that let the reader do the work of putting together the relationship.
Well, I've incorporated some of Isidore's texts into creative projects along those lines. So,
see, that's
and I'm
awesome.
not the only one who's done that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, but that's what he offers. And so, like I said, in some ways, you could see him as a very, conservative is the wrong word. Like as a fundamental building block for learning in the Middle Ages. But you can also see him as this like kind of wildly out there player with language.
He's showing a way of approaching language that you don't get to see a lot of, except that they're constantly referring to him, I suppose. But it feels so antithetical to some of the other forms of thinking about language and meaning, right? This is not how Augustine treats things.
Or Dante.
Yeah, this is not how, Dante puts Isidore in heaven, but this is not really how Dante treats things very often.
Mm-mm.
And it's not how, as I understand it, because I've only dipped into him a little bit, it's not how Thomas Aquinas treats things, right? That's not how you make an argument, Isidore. You can't just break words apart and say they kind of sound like these other words, and therefore you've won the day. That's not how it works. Except what if it were? Like there's also a kind of conspiracy theorist vibe to Isidore sometimes, which I enjoy quite a lot because it's not actively harming me and the world around me. But so it's just fun at this remove. I don't know. I like the idea that words are that powerful. I have felt that power of words, and while I don't think they've been sort of divinely organized the way Isidore seems to think, I cannot but respect the care and attention and play that he brings to his treatment of language.
Yeah. And again, coming back to a point we were making earlier, the kind of care and attention he brings to his treatment of language, kind of in the abstract in terms of signification and audibility and so on. But also, like I said, descending into the materiality in terms of orthography, the shaping of the letters, and the surfaces that you write upon. I love the way in book 6, which is a part of that cluster of sort of churchy material. This is book 6 is on sacred books and ecclesiastical offices, right? Offices of the church and so on. In there, he talks also about libraries and translators and different kinds of things you might write upon. So he talks about wax tablets that you might write upon with a stylus. He talks about sheets of papyrus and gives you the different formats. He talks about parchment in an incredibly awesome passage. And he talks broadly about bookmaking. And in his section on bookmaking, he says this neat thing. He talks about the different size formats. And he says, they were made not only on papyrus sheets or on parchment, but also on the intestinal membranes of elephants or on the interwoven leaves of mallows or palms. And in that parchment section, he unpacks the different qualities and different sort of species of parchment pages, describing where they were invented and how you might use them. And I just think this is such a beautiful passage. It's so cool. He says, they were made at first of a muddy color, that is yellowish, but afterwards white parchment was invented at Rome. This appeared to be unsuitable because it soils easily and harms the reader's eyesight, as the more experienced of architects would not think of putting gilt ceiling panels in libraries or any paving stones other than of Christian marble, because the glitter of gold wearies the eyes and the green of the Christian marble refreshes them. Likewise, those who are learning money changing put dark green cloths under the forms of the coins, and carvers of gems look repeatedly at the backs of scarab beetles, than which nothing is greener, and painters do the same, so that they can refresh the labor of their sight with the greenness of those scarabs. I'm like, what the hell is going on there? I mean, he's talking about, the effect of bright white parchment on the eyes and the effect of it and so on. But it goes into these, it's like, I don't want to say a flight of fancy, but it takes us into all these different worlds. The ceiling panels, the gilt ceiling panels in the libraries, the green marble paving stones, the shiny gold coins with dark green cloths under them, the gem carvers that look away from the precious stones that they're carving to look at the backs of scarab beetles than which nothing is greener. Like it's visuality in this kind of, intoxicating, kind of dizzying way. I don't know. I think it's just incredible.
Can I just tag on one little etymology that I found as we were talking? Because you just look at this book, you just stumble upon it, and you see all sorts of great things. This is in another part of the books on the church. This is from book 8, and it's about the word hope, which in Latin is spes, S-P-E-S. And spes is so called because it is a foot for someone going forward, as if it were est pace. There is a foot.
Nice.
So I'm really interested in this idea of reference books as great books of literature, because I don't think most people think of them that way. And yet, you grew up reading encyclopedias. I have some reference books and things like that are dear to me. I'm curious if there's any sort of reference books you particularly want to just say a few words about.
I'm kind of of two minds. I'm like, on the one hand, like, oh, what are other things we've talked about on the podcast could we kind of put in the category of reference books? And that's one conversation.
Yeah.
The other thing I'm remembering as a child, I don't know about if you did this, obsessively read the Guinness Book of World Records.
I did.
I had committed much of that to memory. And every time a new edition came out, man, I was on it. It's crazy, right?
That is great. Well, I know that there are some other medieval books that you care about in this vein.
Oh, well, like the Glossa Ordinaria, for example. So in some ways, a little bit of a misnomer. It makes it seem like there's this one book that's the gloss on the whole Bible, and there really isn't. There's like a lot of different versions. It gets standardized at a particular point, but there's a lot of different versions. But basically what they're doing is giving you a gloss or a kind of a basic allegorical interpretation, a kind of, this word means that word, in a way that actually Isidore talks about 4 Bible verses. And so they'll sometimes give you multiple different meanings. So they'll give you a kind of historical interpretation of it. They'll give you a moral interpretation, like what's the moral lesson for you might take away, and what might be a spiritual dimension that would tell you something about where you'll go in the afterlife. So that kind of, I guess it's a reference book in the sense that you dip into it, right? You're looking for, what does Luke chapter 2, verse 5 tell me, right? What are the allegorical interpretations? So that's a super popular one in the Middle Ages. Again, lots of manuscripts. What else? It's kind of hard to say. I feel like reference books, like the encyclopedias are doing the reference book work, but there's also a kind of, I don't know what to call it, a reference-like quality to it. The allegorical glosses, the interpretations that are attached to things like Virgil's Aeneid, other major literary works, Ovid's Metamorphoses, that take each phrase or sentence or story out of those works and unpack them as if they were the Glossa Ordinaria unpacking the Bible, or Isidore doing what he does to basically everything. That is, taking an existing text and unpacking it, like unfolding it, as if you had like a folded up piece of origami into an elaborate shape, or paper airplane or a hat or something, and you unfolded it, right? That's what the allegories are doing. They're taking this thing that's all folded up and folding it out into its whole capaciousness.
Yeah.
So I don't know if those are reference books exactly. I think it's the encyclopedias that satisfy that itch, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, see, for me, for medieval texts, I got really excited about grammars.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, of course, I suppose. But there's 2 grammars that I'm particularly fond of. Actually, no, there's 3. Oh, God, there's more. All right, I'm going to talk about 2 of them, though. One of them is called the First Grammatical Treatise,
Mm-hmm.
This is the first grammatical treatise of Old Norse in particular, which is a language I have not studied, but there is an English translation of the text, and it's quite thin. And it is gorgeous in the sense that you have somebody who clearly knows Latin grammar, like who studied a bit of that and is trying to apply this to a language that it's never been applied to before and is reasonably different from Latin. And the struggle and excitement of doing that is very palpable in this little book. And I love that about it. I just love how eager he is. It comes through and it's completely charming. The other one that I quite like is Virgilius Maro Grammaticus. He is from about the 7th century, so I guess a little bit after Isidore, maybe. Though we don't know a lot about him. And he wrote this absolutely wild grammar that is just wrong about everything, especially about metrical stuff. I remember the metrical stuff being completely off the mark and not having anything to do with how Latin poetry is actually read or understand or how the meter works. It just didn't seem to work at all. And it's caused a real difficulty for scholars to talk about, like, well, what is going on here? Because, it doesn't read like parody, but it's really weird. I don't know. I love that sort of thing.
Yeah, you like it when language is kind of pushed to its limits, don't you?
Of course. That's what limits are for. Pushing it. Well, we should talk about what we're going to read next time. What are we reading next time?
We're reading Nizami Ganjavi's Layla and Majnun. We wanted a text that would allow us to talk about the 12th century and to talk about some big currents in language. And this is one that's going to let us talk about Persian literature specifically, but also kind of putting Persian literature in the world literature frame, like thinking about what does it look like when you center the 12th century, not on, French Romance or Latin epic, but rather on Persian poetry. And I think that'll be a really fun discussion. And it's a story that has all kinds of interesting origins, but also has such interesting afterlives. I feel like there'll be a lot to say. And
it's a story, which we haven't done for a little while.
Yeah.
I mean, Isidore is not a story. Boethius is barely a story. Song of Songs is not really a story.
I guess technically, that's true.
So we've skipped stories for a few months, and now we're back. Books
come in many flavors.
Oh yeah. All right. Well, I'm excited. I have not read this book before. I know a little bit about it, but not much, and I am keen to learn more.
I'm actually really looking forward to it because there's a translation by Dick Davis that came out not too long ago, and I really like his work. We've read some of his translations in the past, and so I'm really happy to have the chance to read Layla and Majnun and his work.
Well, that's great. That's awesome. I'm looking forward to it. Listeners, I hope you're looking forward to it as well. In the meantime, if you would like to get in touch with us, you can always email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything that we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/69, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.